are literally shaping the planet.
Purpose is the only pathway to a regenerative future.
We have a choice to stay with the status quo or to change.
What is the point of trying to be just resilient when we can actually innovate?
I am really excited to be here and talking with you all today. I am going to be talking about Greystar's sustainability program and really kind of talk about the evolution of that program. I'll give some general background on Greystar and then really dive into kind of our program makeup and then some key trends for our industry, but they're also really kind of our key focus areas and key drivers of where our program is going as well. Before I get into that, I wanted to just give some additional background. Thank you so much, Matthew, for introducing me. But really my passion for sustainability started at a very young age. My mom was super passionate about it, and it was something we always talked about in the house when I was growing up. And then I ended up taking AP Environmental Science in high school and absolutely loved it and knew that this was kind of the path I wanted to follow. So in undergrad, I studied environmental science and business, but they were two completely separate worlds. My environmental science side was very focused on kind of the science of conservation and really being out in nature and physically making a difference. And then, of course, the business was very just general business focus. So that's why I ended up getting my MBA with a concentration in sustainability, really to bridge the gap. And right after graduating, I joined with Greystar, and it was a really amazing opportunity because we were doing a lot of little things, but we didn't really have a program in place. It was an opportunity to really create a program for Greystar as an organization. But I will say it started off, like I think most sustainability programs, certainly not all, but a lot, especially in the real estate world, it really started off as a way to be transparent with our investors and our clients and show what we were doing. But we weren't necessarily really driving to improve our efforts year over year. It was just kind of more than a check the box, but I would say close to checking the box that we were doing something. We had resources dedicated to it. And as you'll kind of see in the presentation today, that's definitely evolved pretty drastically. That this is an area where we really are trying to be a thought leader, especially as our portfolio's just grown so much. So before I dive into it, I always like to include this slide. Hopefully most of us are very familiar with why sustainability is important, especially when we're talking about buildings and real estate. But buildings have an enormous impact on the environment. They account now for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, nearly 40% of energy use, and even in some cities and countries, we're seeing 60% of solid waste being generated from buildings. So clearly, we have a opportunity and a requirement to address these issues head on. So before we talk about kind of sustainability at Greystar, I wanted to give a very brief overview of Greystar for those who may not be familiar. Greystar is the global leader in rental housing. We primarily focus on multifamily, student housing, and active adults. We are a fully integrated firm where we own, operate, and develop communities. We're currently operating in 13 countries and manage 2,500 communities, which represents now over 693,000 units and serves approximately 1.5 million residents. So clearly, even when just thinking about Greystar, we have a huge global footprint. And so when we're thinking about programs, especially a program like our sustainability efforts, it's really critical that what we do is as standardized as possible, obviously thinking about the regional differences that we need to be taking into consideration, but having a program and a process that is scalable and repeatable, regardless if we're talking about California or Singapore. So diving into our sustainability program, it's really built on minimizing our environmental impacts, and this is through the improvement of our performance, really around energy, water, waste. But it's also about ensuring that we have operating practices, tools, resources, policies, and procedures in place to help ensure that scalability and really empower our wider teams to embed sustainability into their business practices. So these kind of 5 buckets, they aren't a holistic view of our program, but I would say that these 5 areas are really key focus areas for us on an ongoing basis. So I'll start quickly with the design standards. So we've been working for the last couple of years to develop global design and development standards. And really this is a piece to be able to standardize the product that we're bringing to market, again, regardless of where we're developing across the world. And it started off as a very high level project, and now it's become very, very detailed. There are a ton of different sections related to design and development, and sustainability was a really critical piece for us to embed into this process as well. So we have a fully dedicated section to sustainable design standards, and these are kind of always evolving. We're always expanding upon this to make sure that we're, of course, looking at standards around the materials that we're using. We're thinking about the impact of the buildings. Do we have energy and water goals or targets that we're designing to hit? We're also talking about now and really embedding some climate risk and resilience strategies, and as well as some health and well-being strategies, especially in light of COVID, to really make sure that this is a holistic kind of guideline that we can be held accountable to ensure that we do have a consistent product that hits our targets and our goals. And I would say a really important piece of these design standards is really having a design for management approach. So making sure that we're not just thinking about what's going into the building and what's going to happen during the design and development process, but also thinking about how is that building going to operate? Is it going to be as operationally as efficient as we expect? Are we going to be able to pull data from it? And really making sure that we're thinking about sustainability throughout the whole life of the asset and not in kind of separate silos like design, development, and operations. And that kind of leads into the next piece, which is, of course, making sure that we have policies and procedures in place for operational efficiency. And really, these are primarily tools and resources to empower our on-site teams to make sure that our buildings are as operationally efficient as possible, or to identify opportunities for increased efficiency. The next bucket is really partnering with our innovation group, which is looking a lot different today than it did even a few months ago, but this is still a critical focus area for our team, making sure that sustainability is embedded to that group, and really looking both at what technologies may have a sustainability focus, but also thinking about what technologies can we implement to address some of the challenges we have in the sustainability world. So one big one that you'll hear me talk about multiple times, but is around data, both quality and coverage. So really being able to work with our teams to see what type of data we can get and how that can help us address those challenges. So the next one is data management and reporting. And I'll start with the data piece because data is the foundation of our sustainability program. And I really think it should be the foundation of most sustainability programs, especially when we're looking at an organizational sustainability program. But this is said all the time throughout the sustainability world, you really can't manage what you don't measure. So it's critical that we have the data component that then we can work to improve over time and hopefully meet our goals and targets. So data management is a huge piece of our program. It also is one of the areas where we have the biggest challenges because especially in residential housing, we don't always have access to resident data. We may only have common area data, and while we may not have control over the tenant's usage, it's still important that we understand our overall performance and whole building performance for reporting purposes, as well as helping to meet kind of our organizational goals. There are also challenges for data capture depending on where we're trying to get data. It's different in every single city. It's different in every single country. So really trying to put practices in place to standardize that as much as possible. So one kind of way we've addressed this is relying on or partnering with third-party vendors that really are focused on data management and capturing that and cleaning it up and being able to report back to us. And then in line with data management is, of course, reporting. We have reporting throughout the year, and then we also have some pretty large annual reporting. So I would say one that really started kind of our sustainability program and led us to where we are today is GRES, which is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. And those who aren't familiar with it, it's an investor-driven kind of annual ESG survey, and it really just looks overall at both the management and performance of a portfolio, as well as at the asset level. So that's a really huge thing for us that has really guided where our program has evolved to. And then the last piece on this is really around engagement. I think engagement is equally, or at least almost as important as the data piece in order to see success with a program. And this is, of course, engagement on our on-site team member side, our resident side, really educating, providing tools and resources to them, but also partnering and engaging with our capital partners and our clients to make sure that we understand their goals and hopefully can align both of our goals as much as possible. And then there are other stakeholders. A really important one that I think we don't talk about all the time is our partnership with our vendors and making sure that we're having the conversation about sustainability and what's important and what our expectations are with them. So I'll cover this super quick. This is just kind of how our team is broken out. I'm sure most of us can relate to this, but we are a very lean and mean team. I, of course, oversee our sustainability efforts, and I sit within our newly formed corporate social responsibility team. And together we make up a team of two, so very lean. But we do leverage and partner with a lot of internal partners as well as external resources. So throughout our business, we've kind of identified leaders and teams across each business line and each region that we can partner with, really to ensure scalability across all business lines and across every region. So this slide, where sustainability matters, I would say that this is definitely specific to Greystar, but I think this can be repeatable really regardless of the industry we're looking at. I think at the top level, being engaged at the industry level and thinking about sustainability at the industry level is really important. One of my favorite things about sustainability within the real estate industry is that it's constantly evolving. And I constantly get to work with our peers and talk about lessons learned and kind of go through best practices and really learn from each other. We all have a very similar goal, and working together definitely, I think, helps us reach that more quickly. And then, of course, as a global company, we want to make sure that we do have policies and procedures that fit across our global program, that really all the regional programs can tie into, so that in as many ways as possible, we can standardize our practices. But of course, it's important to look at things regionally as well and think about what are the expectations of that region, what's the legislation in that region, are we prepared to be in compliance with that? I think that's a really big driver for our regional programs, and really thinking about not just what do we need to do this year, but thinking forward as well, and what will we need to be prepared for in the future so we can start embedding that into our processes today. And then, of course, this goes down to a portfolio level, and the way we really look at that is the strategy of the portfolio. So what are our requirements from our investors? Are we going to have to report to GRES? Do we have specific objectives or targets we need to hit? If it's a development portfolio, do we need to build to a certain green building standard, et cetera? And then finally, the last piece would be the asset level. So really thinking about that design to disposition and thinking about how we're talking about what's going into the building, but also thinking about how will that affect us at the disposition process. So a place that really comes into play here is around climate risk and resiliency, and making sure we are embedding that hopefully we're in a better position and we can kind of prove out our efforts when we get to the disposition stage. Perfect. And then these are key drivers for our program. I would say the top two are certainly the most important for us. Legislation obviously plays a huge role. We need to, again, make sure we're in compliance and prepared for what may be coming down the line. And then our stakeholders. So especially when we're talking about our capital partners and our clients, really making sure that our program is up to a place where we'll meet their objectives and their goals and their expectations, and that we're not just saying we're doing these things, but we're actually proving it out as well. That's really critical. And then, of course, it also matters to our team members, and our residents. This really covers every single stakeholder category, kind of like we talked about before. So brand equity, I think this is also an important driver. I think sustainability is an expectation across the board, and to have a program in place, I do think it really helps improve your brand equity, and making sure that sustainability, again, isn't just kind of a greenwashed program where we're talking about what we're doing, but not really showing what we're doing. So really embedding that into the culture and the strategy of our business. And then the last two are pretty obvious, but of course, reduction in spend, implementing efficiency measures, and being able to prove that out and hopefully see a reduction in our utility spend. And then finally, again, increased asset value. That could be through efficiency projects. It could be through mitigating climate risks, a lot of different things, but certainly a driver for our program. So again, the way our program's kind of structured, we have an overarching global sustainability program, and that's really where we have the policies and the procedures that govern our program overall. But then we have the regional programs that tie into that. So it's broken out currently by Americas, North and South, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And really within each of those subregions, we have a committee or working group that is interested in sustainability and really helping to scale those efforts regionally, but again, tying back into that global program. So now to move on to the sustainability trends, and really these again are kind of our key focus areas and drivers of where we're going for the future of our program. So I'll touch on these briefly, as I know we had a delay with the timing and everything and don't have a ton of time, but I want to talk about climate risk, carbon neutrality, health and well-being, and then finally technology and data, which really kind of ties through all three. So starting with climate risk, this is a conversation that's been really important to us and our investors for several years now. But it's something that we're in the process of really trying to embed into our business practices. So there are two ways to look at climate risk. There are the physical risks, which are, of course, the catastrophic events, changes in weather patterns, severe hurricanes, fires, et cetera. But there's also the transitional risk, which isn't talked about as often. And this is really thinking about what types of policies are in place or infrastructures in place to protect a certain region or city from a potential catastrophic event. So where we're kind of at in our program is really partnering with our risk management and insurance group and partners to map out our physical climate risks across our global portfolio, and just first understand where those risks are, and then also understand what standards or policies can we implement to mitigate those risks. And then the more challenging piece is definitely figuring out the transitional risk and how do we measure this or put a metric towards it. But it may be as simple as working with local regulators and governments to ensure that there are policies and infrastructure in place to address any potential risks. So decarbonization, this is also a very kind of hot topic that we've been talking about with our investors. I think it's a very challenging one, especially again, when we're talking about residential housing and thinking about how do we design and develop residential buildings that are carbon neutral, and then especially thinking about how do we renovate buildings to be carbon neutral. So we're working with that in partnership with a few of our capital partners currently. But really at the most basic level, when thinking about carbon neutral buildings, first and foremost, you have to understand where your carbon footprint is or where you expect it to be if you were to do nothing to address it. So measure that, disclose that, and then ultimately reduce the demand, the energy demand, implement and generate renewables, ideally on-site, but you can also use off-site renewables to kind of hit the balance of what's remaining, and then constantly improving upon that. So while we may be talking about carbon neutrality now, it may in the future develop and evolve to, we're talking about a carbon neutral building that also has zero waste or is net zero for water use, and really thinking about what's coming again down the road. Another really challenging area of this, but something that's really important, especially again when we're talking about buildings, is the embodied carbon piece. So the operational carbon really only represents 50% of the carbon footprint of that building, and the other 50% comes from construction and the materials going into that building. So really understanding how do we address that, and how do we make it so that these buildings can truly be carbon neutral in the future, because we're already seeing legislation come into play in New York City, across Europe, where this will be a requirement in the future. And it's also something that's important to us, and it's important to our investors to have an answer for and really understand what can we implement to kind of reach these goals. So the next one is around health and well-being. Again, this has been a topic that has been talked about in our industry for several years, but I think in light of COVID and still dealing with the effects for the foreseeable future, it's been brought even more attention. But I do think this is going to be something that our residents just expect, that we have a healthy building. And I think standards like the Well Building Standard, as well as Fitwell, and really being able to verify and showcase that these are actually healthy buildings, I think will go a really long way in the future. So of course, the Well Standard is pretty, I mean, most people are familiar with it, but it's really thinking about how we as humans interact with our buildings, and our buildings can make us either healthier or impede our health. And so really thinking diligently, especially during that design and development process, about what we can implement and how we can make these buildings more, I guess, user-friendly to an extent, but really a place that is healthy and can potentially even make our residents healthier by being in them. And then Fitwell is a similar certification, primarily based in the US, but also really looking at the interaction between humans and our buildings. And one interesting thing, especially with Fitwell, they recently came out with a viral response module, kind of in response to COVID, but I think these certifications and types of verifications are just going to expand as this has been brought front and center, not only to us in this industry, but to our residents, really to all of our stakeholders. So I think this will just continue to grow in importance. And then finally, the data piece. So we really think of this as connected buildings, making sure that we don't just have smart units, but have and a dumb building, but really have a smart building that has the infrastructure to support all of those units. So when looking at that from a sustainability lens, it of course is back to having access to data. So making sure that we can get access to the whole building data and then break that out however we need to, which of course can lead to increased efficiency as we can identify opportunities for improvement, improve upon our maintenance practices, and we can also identify potential issues. So that could be a water leak or a meter that's not working. And then another important piece about the data is really understanding how our residents or our tenants are using the building and making sure that they're adaptable. So a good example of this is obviously with COVID as well, more and more people are working from home, and making sure that our buildings are set up to handle that. So do we have building-wide Wi-Fi? How do we adapt to that? Do we have spaces that residents can work at? And really thinking, again, about how these buildings can have more than just one use so that we can prolong the life of them. And then the final piece on here, which I'm actually super excited about, it shouldn't necessarily say resident engagement. This can be just engagement in general, team member and resident. But being able to use that data to directly engage our team members or our residents. So one thing that we're working on right now that I'm super excited for is taking the data, real-time data, and being able to say, okay, resident A, you used 10% more water this month than the average unit in this building. Of course, taking into account the size of the unit, number of people in the unit, et cetera. But be able to showcase that you used more than the average, and then say, here are 5 tips to reduce your water usage for next month. And then ultimately be able to get that data on whether that engagement had an impact or not, which I think it could have a really large impact. And being able to, again, prove that out, I think is just an enormous opportunity for us. And I know I just have 1 minute left, so I'll do this really quickly. But for those that are just starting out on their sustainability journey, I think there are a few things. First and foremost, you need to be committed to it. It needs to be something that's really important to your organization and something that you want to kind of evolve and develop over time. I think in line with this, you also need to understand how you're going to capture and manage your data. And once you've kind of set that baseline, then you can kind of move to these other efforts of implementing your program, embedding sustainability across business lines, across regions, whatever may make sense for your business, and then finally reaching kind of that final destination of value creation, and really being able to be a thought leader across the space within the industry. So I think I'm right at time. I, again, apologize for the technology issues. You can always reach out to me with any questions. I'd be happy to have a private conversation with you about kind of where we've been or just answer any questions. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Lexie. Real quick, there was one question in the chat. I think we can cover it just in a quick second here. The question was from Miguel. He said, how can startups in the prop tech space participate in your sustainability initiative?
You can certainly get in touch with me. And usually, again, it's kind of a combination of my team as well as our innovation group, which again looks a little bit different, but I would say just reach out to me and we can certainly have a discussion and talk about any potential next steps.